Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm just going to admit some people. No, there's no people left. Cool. Do you want to share the screen, Barnabas, so I can give an introduction to James, then we can get going. So the plan for this evening is I'll give a brief introduction. We'll then hand it over to James to do a talk on galleries for about a half hour, and then myself and Barnabas will ask some questions, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So if you do have any questions throughout, just post them in the chat, and then we can ask them to him at the end. So welcome everyone to this special event with the British Association for Holocaust Studies, where we'll hear from James Bulgin, who is the head of content for the new recently opened Holocaust Galleries at Imperial War Museum. But James and the team of curators have been working on this project since 2016 as part of Imperial War Museum's phased regeneration. Before joining Imperial War Museum, James worked as a commercial theatre producer, writer and director on the West End and in the national tours. He's currently completing a PhD at Royal Holloway, the Crosslands Scholarship on Holocaust and Cold War history. He's presented at conferences in the UK, Israel and Germany. As I said, today James will be giving us a overview of the galleries, and then some questions from us and from the audience. So I'll pass it over to you, James. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. I'm just going to talk you through what we've done and using some of the gallery images to have a quick chat about the kind of conceptual approaches that underpin that. I'm conscious that some of you would have been to see the gallery so far and some of you won't, so I'll try and sort of straddle that reality. So go to the next slide, please, Barnabas. So as Charlie just mentioned, the project to do new Holocaust galleries at IWM was actually part of a broader master plan objective, which started back in 2010, and that master plan objective was driven forwards by the First World War centenary. So IWM had a Holocaust exhibition, as you'll know, which opened in 2000, and it had First World War galleries and Second World War galleries. But the museum wanted to completely kind of recalibrate the way that it engaged with its narrative, and in so doing, gutted the central part of the museum building, which involved sacrificing the First and Second World War galleries in order to create new First World War galleries. So that was part one of the master plan. Part two involved creating new Second World War galleries, and the initial ambition was to move what is now the previous exhibition down in the building and put it above what would have been the new Second World War galleries. So you'd have First World War, Second World War, Holocaust. As that conversation evolved, it became pretty obvious that actually moving the previous exhibition wasn't really up to the moment in time in which this was happening, because of course Holocaust historiography had moved on so far in the intervening 20 years or so. Also had Holocaust museology that just moving the current exhibition would have been quite a problematic step. So instead of doing that, new Holocaust galleries were created, and that's just about where I joined at the start of 2016. The image that you can see here is the footprint of this. So the top image is where the Second World War galleries sit in the building, and the bottom image is the Holocaust galleries. And the reason I wanted to start with this is because it does inform one of the central parts of this project, which is about trying to find a way of spatially and intellectually finding a relationship between the Second World War and the Holocaust. It's something that I was very mindful of, and I know that obviously a lot of scholarship was concentrating on around about the time that we started to work on this project, and particularly I suppose adumbrated in David Cesarani's book, The Final Solution, very much about recontextualizing the Holocaust within the broader narrative of the Second World War. And that's really what we were trying to do here. It was interesting actually that this is the first project in the world, to the best of my knowledge, which has done this. So they're entirely separate galleries, to be very clear, entirely separate galleries, built as part of the same project, but with connections. And what those connections were and what that meant in practical terms was a completely undefined question when we started on the project, and that really informed a lot of our interpretive and spatial approaches, and I'll talk to you a bit about that as we go. Though for those of you who are familiar with the previous exhibition at the museum, the other thing worth noting is that on a practical level, these new galleries are ever so slightly larger than the previous ones, but they're on one floor rather than two. So we've lost the whole issue with trying to sort of make sense of what the, you know, how to make sense of being on two floors and finding the right moment to do that. So all that's gone. So the previous exhibition is currently being decanted, as they called it, and will become a different part of the museum in future. So this is in a completely different part of the building, the new galleries. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please, Barnabas. So I wanted to show you this to start off with before we got into any of the gallery renders, because I'm conscious that with the people that are on the call today and as members of the British Association of Holocaust Studies, these are the sort of things which might be more of interest to you than they would be of some people, and that's to do with the way that we used text to kind of package the narrative. So the first thing that I did when I started on the job was to write a narrative, and then the second thing that I did was to appoint an academic advisory board who then helped us to steer that narrative. And I would say that we've been extraordinarily fortunate to have had an incredible advisory board chaired by Dan Stone, who were very much with us every step of the way with this process. And I started on this narrative with Dan, and then we thrashed it out, and then sat down with the board and thrashed it out some more and defined some underlying themes which have really informed our approach to the galleries, which we're really supposed to sort of try and harness to the best of our ability the kind of key vectors of Holocaust historiography as they existed at the time that we were starting. Of course, on a practical level, that manifests in various different ways, but the most conspicuous manifestation is within the text. So this is the text hierarchy as it finally settled within the galleries. So the largest piece there you can see is called a section text. We call that internally. It's 150 words, and then a subsection, which is the smaller one, and then captions, and then one text device, which is actually unusual. I don't know if it's completely distinct to this production, but it's certainly unusual, is what we call meta texts. So that's the reversed out, the white text on the black background, and we use those carefully and sparingly, but where we felt that we needed to throughout the galleries, either to translate certain words or to explain certain kind of issues in historiography to do with ethics of representation or issues within historiography. You can see there, this one is about Kristallnacht. So we, you know, why we don't use the word Kristallnacht in the core text, but we talk about the November pogrom, for example. The one thing I did want to mention as well, because it's really crucial to the approach that we've taken, is the second tier of text, the subsection. Every single subsection text has a contemporaneous quote on it from a Jewish individual from a range of different sources. Contemporaneity is a central part of our approach throughout the galleries, so we don't use any post-war sources through the core gallery narrative. We only use sources that are contemporaneous to the moment that's being articulated. So the narrative never looks forward, it only articulates the moment that it's talking about, using contemporaneous sources. We wanted to use contemporaneous Jewish voices within the subsections, and actually most of the titles of subsections are also taken from contemporaneous sources. In fact, I think Charlie helped us with that a little bit when he was working with us on the project. So we tried to broaden out the network, doing that as broadly as possible. And the reason we did that was because one of the most sort of central things that we wanted to achieve was to be very aware of whose narrative that we were telling in these new galleries, and we didn't want to just repeat. And I know this will be very familiar to all of you, because it's a really kind of well-worn idea in Holocaust museology, but we didn't want to just be another gallery that exemplify or you know, talks about what the Nazis had done. We wanted to talk about what Jewish people had experienced in you know, various different forms throughout the galleries. And so by positioning that contemporaneous voice within this, that was really important to us. And even by using, you know, the use of the title, it meant that rather than just explaining things from the perspective of what the Nazis were doing, we were trying to condition our thinking all the way along to say, but what does this mean for the person who's experiencing it? Which was really central. The other thing, the reason which I wanted to start with this text, was just to make the point that Holocaust historiography is vast. And Dan Stone talks about, you know, 4,000 books a year being submitted to the library at Yad Vashem, and there's so much written, and there's so much to be said, and there's so much nuance, But in practical terms, we had to find a way to engage with all of that in a relatively small amount of text. So 150 words on section text and 75 on some sections and 50s on captions and the rest, really. So that is I cannot emphasize enough quite how much of a practical challenge that is when it becomes practical, and how difficult it is to try and distill and crystallize so much content into this relatively small entities. Let's go to the next one, please, Barnabas. So this is the opening space coming off the main museum atrium into the new galleries. It's a media piece. It's not fixed graphics. It's a 40-minute film, also there or thereabouts, which we call The Presence of Absence. And this was really important. This was a really early conceptual idea, and it serves a few different functions, but it does speak to some of the really important underlying themes of the new galleries. One of the most central ones of which is that it's really important to us that visitors thought about this as something that happened in our world. And I know that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but we became very mindful of the fact that this history is often kind of told through black and white images, and it encourages people to think of these things as something that happened in a black and white distant past, in a sort of a version of reality that is completely distinct from our own, and that somehow the world in which these things happened, and it's been described as Planet Auschwitz by some scholars and thinkers. This idea that that reality is not this reality, their world is not our world, and I think we wanted to say, well, actually, in many respects, it is, and we walk amongst the traces of it. So this piece, it uses footage. It was our team from the museum. We sent out to across Europe for months to take. To film scenes. The one instruction that I gave them when they went is that they should only ever film anything from this perspective it could have been seen by a Jewish person, not by a Nazi. So, for example, this shot is from Auschwitz-Birkenau, as you probably recognise, but there's no shots from within the Deathscape building at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Everything's just kind of on the inside looking out, and everyone on the outside looking in. Most of the scenes within this sequence are from sites of pre-war life. But some sites of persecution too, and all across, from small details to large details, and it's not interpreted in the space. I think for me it was really important that visitors just respond to this however they want to. It doesn't have any sort of specific interpretive function. I think I interpret it in different ways, but to me any kind of different interpretation is also legitimate. You notice the element on which it's projected is a sort of a leaning solid structure, which is something we try to do throughout the galleries, to talk about film and photos as objects, not as just kind of things emanating from the ether and them having kind of physical form and identity. And it also serves a really practical function, which is to sort of negotiate the relationship between the public bustle of the museum space and then the internal space of the galleries. And the other really important thing which you'll notice, and you may well have picked up on any of the kind of commentary around the edges of these galleries, is that they're quite bright. The brightness was a really important idea for us for a variety of different reasons. Probably mostly because we were so determined to try and disrupt any idea or notions of kind of inevitability, and to me, as soon as you walk into a dark space, it almost kind of predefines the direction of the narrative, and it suggests that there's a sort of teleological inevitability about this, and that's something we were really keen to push back against. It suggests that these things happen in the shadows, or in unseen places, which again I think is really unhelpful, and it also suggests somehow to visitors that the only appropriate response is kind of silence, and we wanted people to sort of move beyond that idea of silence being the only appropriate response. So for all of those things that have informed that approach throughout the gallery. So there's different shades of blue throughout the galleries. The light does vary because there's so many practical dimensions to the way that spaces are lit and why, but nevertheless, as a conceptual approach, it was there. And I have to say it was there from very, very early on. And weirdly, actually, it was something that I'd had in my head from when I was first employed on the project. And then when we employed the designers through the tendering process, it was a central part of their tendering thing as well. So there was a strange sort of serendipity to the fact that we both had this same idea individually and kind of came together and moved forward under that premise. Okay, let's go to the next place, please, Barnabas. Next slide. So then the next space that we enter is we've always called internally the life before. It's not called that in the space, because obviously before suggests after, but nevertheless the idea was that before, I'd read a lot about this, and I'd read a lot of commentary about this. And when I started on the project, I read a lot of the scholarship about Holocaust museums. I'd read a lot of the scholarship about the what is now the previous exhibition at the museum. And for me, I just really wanted to do whatever we could to try and position Jewish individuals, communities within the narrative, with agency and autonomy to whatever extent we could. And it was really important for us that before visitors saw a single swastika or set of Nazi uniform or any kind of visual trace of Nazi iconography, they saw Jewish individuals as autonomous and self-defined. So this whole space is about that. It's space to sort of point towards the massive diversity and plurality of pre-war Jewish life across Europe. You can see in this space around the edge, a lot of the flat surfaces are actually screens, and they show a range of different images and pieces of film. There's actually about over 1,200 pieces of film and images in that space. The idea is, and this was really central from the get-go, and I was really keen that this should be a statement of fact, not of kind of concept, that no two visitors into this space should ever see the same set of images. You'd have to be in this space for about 20 minutes to see the same image twice. And wherever you turn, different things are happening, and it's about, like I say, plurality and diversity. I was at a conference about 5 years ago, and a scholar made this point which really stuck with me, where he said we still talk in the field about the Jews in the same way, with the definite article, in the same way that the Nazis talked about die Juden, and I thought, well, we wanted to sort of just disrupt that. So around the edge, then there are a range of different images of fixed graphics. There's at least one fixed graphic from every single place that the Nazis did go to, but every single image in this space is taken before the Nazis arrived or wherever they were going. So every single individual in this space is living or is caught in the moment of their life before the Nazis interrupted it, which is really important too. You can see through the space too, these glass pillars. They're just about individuals. They appear throughout the galleries. They take a cropped detail from a contemporaneous photo, but then the original photo is displayed just next to it. So you see the original photo and the cropped detail next to it. And then they have these biographies on them, Satan as we call them. They're written in the present tense, again, which was about kind of disrupting inevitability, and it's just about the details of that person's life. I don't like the word story personally, but in museums a lot of people talk about personal stories. I'm not keen on the word story because I feel like I think a lot and write, work quite a lot with ideas of narrativity as being a sort of reductive concept. So I think they're not stories, it's just about the complexity of individuals' experiences within their lives. I was really unconvinced about the present tense thing, funny enough, and we went to our advisory board, and I expected them all to kick the idea straight back in our face, and they didn't. They all quite liked it, which was quite surprising to me. So we pursued it. So anyway, that's the opening space. Let's move on, please, Barnabas. So then we go into the next space, which is all about Europe before and after the First World War. There's an AV piece that seeks to engage with some of the ideas of kind of colonialism and Holocaust historiography, and then there's this, which is all about the elections in the late 1920s and early 1930s in Germany. The reason I wanted to use this image is because it does elucidate what we've sought to do in terms of our interpretive approach for design in respect to the use of materials and shapes and forms. So we haven't done in this space anything which I would call kind of explicitly scenographic insofar as mimetic scenography. So we haven't done that thing of trying to recreate real environments in the way that museums used to historically. The IWM used to have something called the Blitz experience, where people would be encouraged to believe that by walking through a kind of scenographic kind of roomscape thing, that they would somehow be kind of stepping through re-entering, you know, the sort of a war, an authentic wartime environment. I'm completely unconvinced by that idea. I think that clearly museums are experiential because that's why people go to them, because there's nothing we're saying here that you couldn't read in a book for yourself. But nevertheless, that experiential doesn't necessarily mean experience. Experiential does mean though lighting, sound, material, texture, space, etc. So with that, those are the kind of the things that we're working with, and we use materials to sort of affectively suggest things. So in this space, because it's about the destruction of the Reichstag and the destruction of democracy in Germany, this is a burnt wood on which these communist and fascist posters face off against each other. It's a burnt wood material because it's about destruction, and the woods that you can see there is about domestic interior spaces, and the Corian is about public municipal spaces. So material has a function, and the shape of material has a function, but it's not, that function is not mimetic scenography. And again, the lack of inevitability here is all about those, you know, the communists and the fascists both sort of vying off against each other. Let's see the next slide, please, Barnabas. So then we go through a space, once we've sort of established how Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933, we come to this space, which is about what Dan Stone called the causal nexus. And again, one of the things which I'd observed in a lot of the Holocaust museums I've been to in this country and across the world is that this whole section about kind of ideology was always told in linear spaces, a progression of linear spaces. And the more I kind of thought about this myself and my sense of this period of time, this phrase causal nexus kept on coming back to me because I thought it is a nexus. It's a nexus of different things. It's not one thing leading in a kind of monocausal way to the next. It's about an intersection and a dialogue between different things. So that's what this space is. So out of the side of this image here is a space on propaganda and international race theory, eugenics, etc. And then the section you can see here is about anti-Semitism, just on the right-hand side there, and the so-called consensus dictatorship, which I thought was really important in terms of public understanding. And what I wanted to try and encourage people to move beyond the idea of the Nazi state as being something which was enforced exclusively through the use or even the threat of force, to say actually that, you know, there's far more consensus and willing complicity in this regime than a lot of our visitors would necessarily think about. So this whole space is about the consensus dictatorship. You can see that the sort of wallpaper at the back there is created from native 17th and 18th century German wood carvings, which one of our designers took all the individual details and created this as a sort of, to speak to that, you know, notion of Hitler's kind of romanticized vision of a German future. But the idea within the design is that it sits very explicitly as a soft facade on top of the underlying kind of threat. So we see through the soft facade. You can just sort of see that little kind of hatch thing there with a picture of Theodor Eicher, with the establishment of the concentration camps, with the SS, with the apparatus of terror is clearly there. But the dialogue between the soft use of power and the underlying threat and violence, etc., was quite important to us. And the use of forms in this case, that when you first look at it, I mentioned before that we haven't used kind of mimetic scenography. The idea with this case is that the shapes and the forms speak to domestic environments. It kind of looks a bit like chairs and tables, etc., but they're sort of so aggressively generic that they don't settle into a sort of single environment. They speak to sort of a range of different potential environments. And you can see there as well the uniforms. They're just at the far end of that case. There's an SS uniform, but it's kind of draped over the back of this plinth that looks a bit like a chair, rather than being put on a mannequin and sort of valorized like that. We want to just treat it like a garment that somebody wore, to try and separate the garment from the wearer. And to look at the relationship with those two things, because again, a really important underlying thing for us was to do with perpetrators, and be really clear about the fact this is something that was done to people by people, that Nazis, you know, ideas of avant-garde and you know, brainwashed, hyper radicalized people, you know, perpetrators really sort of dominate the public imagination of this period. And we wanted to say, well, actually, you know, Christopher Browning was talking a long time ago about, you know, these men being ordinary, and these women, actually gender was a really important part of our approach too, and we wanted to try and, you know, confront people with that a bit more. Let's go on to the next one, please, Barnabas. This is here. So then we look at this space we're about to move into is about how this then impacts Jewish people living within the Reich. But I wanted to show you this image because this is about the relationship between the war and the Holocaust too. So we have these sections through the galleries where you get this intersection of the war and our narrative, and they appear through the language is almost as if it's pushing through the floor from the gallery downstairs to, you know, sort of anchor this. Moving on, let's move on because I'm taking far too long. So then we go through this space, which is about what this means for, as I say, for Jewish people. So just to the right of this, there's this idea of encirclement. So this space is really about what the Nazis are doing in terms of the expansion of the Reich, policies of Aryanization, taxation, etc., and then what that means for Jewish people in the way that they experience it within their own environments. And this is very much about Austria. This is also about how we use images at eye level, but also kind of pacing, but I won't get too into that now. I'm happy to answer questions about it. Let's go to the next one, please. So then we move through a section on emigration, which we don't see here, but you'll see in galleries about kinder transport, refugee domestics, that whole final phase of emigration, the international refugee crisis, very important for our narrative. Kinder transport, we try and talk about from the perspective of parents, more than the kids really. But then we come into this section, which is about ghettos. So again, here we've tried to separate out what the Nazis are doing in terms of the administration of the ghettos, Nazi administration, and then the line of plinths on the right hand side is then about how that's experienced by Jewish people living within the ghettos. Tries to use materials to suggest the different types of environments in which ghettos were created, but also not to just use Warsaw, Łódź, Krakow as the sort of the lens through which ghettos are understood. So using a whole different range of ghettos, but there's a specific text language that then specifies which ghetto things come from. Let's go to the next one, please. And then I wanted to just show you here within this, there's an AV piece. We use these through the galleries quite a lot. We call them generatives. They're supposed to feel sort of infinite. So rather than just using sort of 5 or 6 images on the loop, we tend to use as many images as we can find for certain areas, and then, you know, allow the record to be complicated and hard to negotiate. And here in the ghettos, one of those is about 740 different images, but where we know the images were taken by a Nazi photographer or a Nazi entering the ghettos, those photos have a black frame around them. So you can see here in this image, and this is from the Billy Georg album, you probably recognize it. This image here has got a black frame around it because it's taken by and you know, a ghetto tourist, Nazi ghetto tourist. Images taken by the likes of Svi Kadushin, Henrik Ross, Mendel Grossman, etc. They're shown without the frame, and we do talk about that within one of these meta texts as well. Let's move on, please. So then we enter the section on the Einsatzgruppen-led mass murders in Central and Eastern Europe, what's been described as the Holocaust by bullets. We use contemporary footage of the environments in which these things occur to lead off on that. So there's 3 screens. The one screen is kind of at a ground level, as you can see to the right there. One's at sort of sky level and one's at a kind of an eye line level. Very careful about in the way that they were shot, not trying to sort of recreate environments. So the focal length changes and the camera movement changes, so it never resolves into actually being a sort of a 360 re-render of the space in the room. But it was about trying to engage with the sort of the materiality of the space, and to say these things happen in our world. What happened in these places is beyond our comprehension, because, you know, and it's ridiculous to assume that we could ever know what the people taken there would have experienced or felt. But we do know the environments which it occurred, and we know what it feels like to be in those places. And then we look at, so there's 5 different locations that are on those 3 screens, and then 5 case studies of those places around the edge, but using the imagery, the imagery from those places as at the size, roughly historically accurate sizes on that piece. Throughout elsewhere, we're very dogmatic with the sizing of images, reprinting them to the best of our knowledge, the size that they would have been historically. But here, rather than using large graphic imagery to sort of precipitate a shocked reaction or to sort of manipulate a reaction from visitors, we use the large images as just of landscapes and environments, and then within those, images of people and atrocity are printed at the size that they would have been, and really contextualized within that. And just see the next one, please, Barnabas. But importantly for us, the ghetto's narrative continues. So the ghetto's narrative wraps around the corner, and it was important when I was taught by David Cesarani on my master's. He made this point, which obviously carries through a lot of his writing as well, which really stuck with me, about the simultaneity of the ghetto's narrative and the Einsatzgruppen narrative, and it was we really wanted to try and engage with that. I was really struggling with the fact that every exhibition that I went to, it was either one or the other. So ghettos following unsubscription or unsubscription following ghettos, and I wanted to, to try and find a way to sort of reconcile those two things in the environment. So the ghettos narrative continues. Incidentally, you can see this fragment of Torah scroll in that case there. We worked really closely on this project with a range of different rabbis. One rabbi in particular, Rabbi Nicky Liss, from the Highgate Synagogue, who was incredibly generous with his time, and came in to advise us on the display of religious objects and description of religious objects, and as far as possible actually placed them in the cases himself, because we were very mindful of ensuring that was done in a way which was as respectful as we possibly could be. But we were able to involve him in the process very early on, so mounts, etc., were developed, having had that conversation with him to ensure that we were doing things correctly and appropriately. Can we go to the next one, please, Barnabas? And then we have at the end of that section here, this object, which I would just like to talk about it, because I think I still can't quite believe that we're able to display this, but this to me is the most important object that we have in the galleries. This is on loan for the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and it's one of the boxes from the Oneg Shabbat archive. I mean, I don't need to tell you what that is, obviously, but it's just so important for us. So we created this whole section to hold this one object in the hopeful anticipation that they'd lend it to us, because for us this is just so significant in terms of challenging the hegemony that perpetrated the term narrative, and to position kind of that Jewish perspective within this. And then in the that case there, that kind of transparent case at the end, is a document from the archive by Jurek Vilna, hearing about the shootings in the Ponari forest, and wondering if that's related to what's happening within the Warsaw Ghetto. And again, really important way for us to present to visitors the messy complexity of the narrative at this stage, to see these two things are happening at the same time. Now we've sort of wrapped it all up within this the term the Holocaust, but actually that is far less kind of coherent than that in many respects. Let's go to the next one, please. So coming off there, we come into this space, which is all about perpetration and decision making. And for me, I always think the conceptual approach to this was very much determined by the idea of, this debate about the relationship between the centre and the periphery, which has been quite active in the historiography for a period of time. The sides to it are left intentionally open. So we wanted to sort of find a way to look at the relationship between sort of small rooms in which decisions of policy is determined or shaped, and then the vast landscapes in which the interpretation of those things occurs, and to properly give a face to the perpetrators there. One of the things I noticed is that Hitler is quite conspicuous by his absence in a lot of Holocaust narratives, because of course he's always by design some distance away from where things are happening on the ground. And so we wanted to make sure that Hitler in the inner circle and others were all kind of centered in this, but to try and establish a relationship between what they're doing and how they're driving ideology and policy, etc., and then how much agency there is on the ground in terms of implementation of those concepts, those ideas. Next one, please. And then we enter a space which is about what happens from 1942 onwards. So there's a lot to talk about in here, but basically this is so the challenge that we constantly face with this history, and I know this is something which you'll all be familiar with, is trying to reconcile the relationship between the micro, the individuals, to make sure this is like a highly personalized as far as possible, but also not to lose sense of scale. And so that's this whole plinth that you're seeing here. That's Georgie Halpern, who I know you'll probably be familiar with, just at the front there. But that whole plinth there is just to do with people. There's got people kind of decontextualized from narrative. Then the rest of this space is about what's happening from 1942 onwards, and how deportations escalate, and the establishment of death camps, etc. We can go to the next one, please, Barnabas. So then we look here is about the end of the ghettos, so deportation from the ghettos, liquidation of the ghettos. You'll see there Mordecai Anielewicz and Korczak as two individuals within that narrative, cases on hiding there. And at this point in the galleries, if we know that we're quoting from individuals who are speaking at the moments kind of proximate to their murder, we then switch to using light to hold their voice. You can see the quote on the plinth there is actually done through a projector from the ceiling. So That was just a conversation that evolved out of a design meeting where we just couldn't strike upon a way of doing that which felt appropriate. So we wanted to use light because it just felt more respectful to articulating that moment in somebody's life. The next one, please, Barnabas. So to the left of or just behind the image that we just saw is this space here. So this is about the killing centres. I'm really mindful of avoiding aesthetics of industrialization in these galleries as much as possible. I got quite kind of concerned, and I know that a lot of scholars have written about this too, that the Holocaust was being kind of over-defined in the public consciousness as sort of the apotheosis of industrialized genocide, and that somehow it was a machine that was set in motion that killed people. And I wanted to be really clear about the fact that this whole thing is much more messy and chaotic. We worked a lot with we had conversations with Caroline Steady-Coles, who'd obviously done her remarkable work at Treblinka, and she was really helpful actually talking to about this, because she was sort of saying some of the things that if you go to Sobibor now, in fact, to the left-hand side of that fixed graphic is the only remaining piece of infrastructure at Sobibor. If you go to Sobibor, you can still see the barbed wire up in the trees where the Nazis left it. And it really struck me that, because I thought, God, they didn't even put up fences. This is so much more improvisational and rough, and infinitely more brutal and barbaric than that idea of kind of factories of death would encourage us to believe. So we wanted to sort of find ways of engaging with that, or at least pushing back against the idea of kind of industrialization. And then the largest case in here, and in fact one of the largest cases in the galleries, is all about belongings. So rather than just kind of piling up anonymous broken pieces of pottery and stuff at the bottom of the case, we tried to find things that helped engage with the humanity of the individuals that might have owned it, and tell us why they might have taken it, etc. But at the back of that case there are quotes from a series of individuals who would from contemporaneous diaries and letters, but we tried really hard there to find quotes not with people contemplating their deaths, but people talking about their plans or expectations of the future, so that we were really trying to do whatever we could again to sort of say, these are futures lost, as we call it in this space. Tony Kushner, who's on our advisory board, said this thing in one of the first meetings that really stuck with all of us. He said it's really important that people understand the chronology of the perpetrators is not the chronology of the quote unquote victims, and here you really sort of see this. So that's something which was really important to us, and is really powerful. Let's do the next one, please, Barnabas. So then we come into the concentration camps. Concentration camps, we wanted people to understand, and things like striped uniforms, which a lot of our visitors walk in with, because of certain films which you'll be familiar with, have this sense of, striped uniforms as being this sort of really potent metaphor or metonym or trope of this thing. So we wanted to, really contextualize these things and use objects to do so. We were donated this piece of barrack that came from Felton, subcamp of Sachsenhausen, which we think is the first time that a section of concentration camp barrack has gone on display in this country like this. But it's important, it's what objects can do, because you seeing it firsthand. You sort of understand its raw, rough, ugly simplicity. It's and in terms of the way we lit that, actually with all the lighting, we tried not to theatricalize any of these things, just to light them as flatly and as undramatically as possible, just to present them as objects. Let's go to the next one, please. And then this is the key moment of connection between the two galleries. So this is a V1 flying bomb that pivots through the floor. So you can see through the floor there is the Second World War galleries below, and this is the Holocaust galleries that we're seeing it from here. The V1 was the product of huge amount of discussion between the content teams of the Holocaust galleries team and the Second World War galleries team, because we wanted to find an object that linked these two narratives. And actually we stumbled across this in the end because, of course, the V1 is the sort of thing which a lot of our visitors will be familiar with because of its relationship to the Second World War and Britain's war experience, but far fewer would ever think about its relationship to the Holocaust. And so that question that comes back time and time again about Britain's relationship with the Holocaust, this was a really important way of doing it, to say, is so much closer than you realize. For example, the V1 was made by slave laborers in tunnels carved by Jewish slave laborers, and just next to the V1, you can just sort of see it on the plinth there, is a pickaxe from Mittelbau Dora. So that would have been used by a Jewish slave laborer in Mittelbau Dora to carve the tunnels in which these things were made. So the relationship between Britain's war and the Holocaust is suddenly really meaningfully, I hope, contextualized here. Let's do the next one, please. And then the uniforms. you know, displaying these things we thought about a lot. So they're all in this case here. The actual mounting of them is a challenge because you don't want to put them on mannequins and sort of, you know, make them these sort of lifelike things in the space, but at the same time just them hanging inert also felt quite dishonest. So I worked with the textile conservator to try and articulate the shape of some of the angles in it to sort of express the broken sort of agony that's associated with the objects, but not in a way that kind of over defines them as being a worn garment. And in the back of this case here, there's these hanging voiles with shadows on them. All of those shadows are taken from original contemporaneous photos that have then been kind of re-rendered onto the voiles. So the sources that kind of tie all this together are all authentic, and things are displayed at their right height, roughly. Let's do the next one, please. And then we come into the stage on the breakdown, the Hungary discrete section. I won't talk about that too much now, but I can. But the breakdown, so the plinths break down as the war is literally breaking down, moving towards the point of liberation. So death marches, attempts to hide the evidence, the final phase of the concentration camps, as law and order, or the system of order starts to completely collapse. And then we move into the next space, please. This is just before this. I just wanted to show you this actually, because this is, I always think this object is so important. So this object is a millstone, obviously carved from a Jewish gravestone. We spoke to Rabbi Liss before deciding to display this, because I wanted to be really sure about whether or not that was something which we should consider. And he felt really strongly that we should actually. And he also translated this for us, which nobody had been able to do before, to make sense of the Hebrew. But he said, you won't believe me when I tell you what this says, but he said the remaining piece of text on this headstone says, "For these I weep, my eyes are shedding tears," and I just couldn't believe it when he told me that. So we put it against the Posen speech. So the relationship between what the Nazis were doing and the sort of the genocidal manifestation of that is elucidated in this single object. Let's do the next one, please. And then we enter the space on liberation. At first we tried to do liberation in terms of the sort of the chaos of liberation, and it wasn't working. Every version of it just felt chaotic and impenetrable, and not in a productive way. It just felt messy and ill thought through. So we stripped everything out and looked at ideas of emptiness instead. So to sort of qualify liberation, not to make it a moment of triumph at the hands of the Allies, but these sort of the emptiness that people experience at the moment of liberation. Using some of the assets, there's a drawing in there by Brian de Greeno, British war artist who was at Belsen, and he's this really remarkable drawing that he did, pencil drawing, where he's across the margins, he sort of scrawls lines saying, I can't capture what I'm seeing. So this whole idea of the Holocaust representing a challenge to the very notion of representation it emerges very early on, obviously. And then let's just do the next one, please, which I think is the last one. And then justice. So this is actually the penultimate space. There's a final space, which I don't have any images of here for some reason, but this is then about notions of justice and the process by which something so vast and complex and vile and barbaric and brutal then has to be somehow formalized and encoded into, which these boxes obviously stand for, the idea of these kind of infinite boxes, which then have to encode this thing in order for it to be pursued. And the idea of these trials being the kind of the birth of international justice. We work with Philippe Sands on this section, just out of shot here. There's the glass pillars. There's one of Raphael Lemkin and one of Hirsch Lauterpacht. And Philippe was really helpful with the writing of the text for this. And then he came in a few weeks ago, and when he saw these two, he sort of stand for a second, and he said, this is really moving to me, James, because of course they never met. Raphael Lemkin and Hirsch Lauterpacht never met in life, but here they stand next to each other as the people who kind of ordered in this, the whole notion of international justice as they did, and that really affected me actually. So then there's a final space on what brings us up to the present day and using testimony, but I'm conscious that I've gone over, so I'll stop there. But please do ask any questions, and I hope that you are able to come and see the museum at some point. I'm handing to you, Barnabas.
Thank you, James. Thanks for a whistle-stop tour of the galleries. I was lucky enough to visit with the Holocaust Educational Trust a few weeks ago, and just seeing you talk through it again has reminded me of places that I want to go back and look and pay even more attention to. Just a couple of questions, I think, from myself and Charlie before we open up to everyone else here. I found it really interesting how you mentioned that you'd worked with some rabbis when putting these things together, and the galleries aim to encompass a lot of these different experiences and a lot of these different images and sort of objects that have a lot of religious and cultural significance. And I wonder if you could maybe say a bit more about the involvement of these contemporary religious or social and ethnic groups in putting the galleries together.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it was really on my mind because I was aware that in the not just our previous exhibition here, but in other exhibitions elsewhere, people curators have made choices about the display of objects which have been completely unconsidered versus cultural religious practice. And I just thought, given the nature of the subject, in any context, frankly, but certainly in the context of this subject, it just felt so problematic that should have occurred. So I thought, and obviously we're really mindful of not then speaking on behalf of people. So I thought the only way to just cut out any danger of that was to literally just go to them. And one of my bugbears is something, I'm not Jewish, and I didn't grow up around Jewish culture too much, but I one of my bugbears now is when people talk about the Jewish community, because my experience is that there are a huge number of Jewish communities which exist really, really differently, and so we didn't want to just go to one person or one place and try and use that as the crystallization. One of the things which we were very mindful of was engaging with Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities and groups, because that's something which IWM hasn't historically always been able to do particularly successfully, and I'm very mindful of that across the whole of the historiography as well. So we did that. We were very lucky, not just in this country, actually in New York as well, dealt with some organizations that specialize in that and try to broaden that out. So in the first instance, when we wrote the text for this section on pre-war life, we brought in a group of different people from a range of different backgrounds. And it was quite difficult. It was an interesting experience because we got in a facilitator, so it wasn't us facilitating that conversation, because obviously that's difficult too. So we got in a professional facilitator, and then we all just sat around the edges and just had to sort of listen to this whole thing being torn apart, which was good. It was good, it was necessary, but it was a strange experience. And just gave them the text and said, look, there you go. And at the end of it, he said, listen, we'll redo it and then go back to you. And then did, and then sent that rewritten one to them, and then sent it elsewhere too, to various different people. And then I think Rabbi Nicky's involved, and we talked to a range of different. Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch has been very helpful as well, actually. But we it just became a sort of a practical thing in the end, because it meant that we could bring in, obviously particularly with COVID stuff, Rabbi Nicky could then just come in and we could just say, look, I know you've seen the drawings, I know you've seen the thing, now you're here, is what do you think of this? And then because he was there, we just said, well, listen, why didn't you put on a pair of gloves and actually put this on the mount yourself? Because that way we know that we've got absolute confidence that you're comfortable with it. So it was a process, but it was definitely worth doing. And I also with survivors, I always said, anyone's always welcome to come to me, and I will go anywhere that you need me to go. So whenever we were contacted, we did. And now that the team have got these really sort of lovely, meaningful relationships with a lot of individual families, both here and across the world, because that's the only way to do it, really. I got invited to Rabbi Nicky's daughter's wedding, which was just the most amazing thing. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much, James. Yeah, it was interesting because I met a few of different people from different groups at the launch event, and I was amazed at how many people were there, just from different backgrounds everywhere. I suppose following on from that point that you made about some of the people having closer connections with the survivors and other groups, on the individuals that you highlight throughout the galleries, either in the totems or in boards or anything like that, obviously there are millions of stories that you could tell, but you obviously then have to make a choice. what ones do you highlight? What ones do you not highlight? Is it a case of if they have a photograph, then that's obviously more beneficial for you because it's easier for two people to identify or not identify? So I was wondering if you could say how you chose or what criteria drove that.
Yeah, sure. It's a really good question. What drove it in the first instance was kind of what we had in the collections, because obviously that's as a sort of a museum, that's the starting point. So there's a bit of a dialogue there with the narrative. So obviously the narrative came first, and then we had to look at the collections that we had, look at the narrative that we had, and then try to find a way to reconcile those two things together and position things. And obviously, there is a dialogue between those things. One sort of steers the other to a certain extent, and then after that, it's really a question of looking at what's available, what's in terms of practical assets, as you say, in terms of photos, and those things do matter, but also what the research tells us about a certain individual or a certain set of circumstances. What's very difficult, actually, and it's something that the curators ended up taking really personally, is that you do have this really overwhelming sense that once you've chosen to use an individual's narrative or move to that idea, if then for some reason it becomes not possible, you become very mindful of the idea that you're somehow re-silencing someone who's been silenced abhorrently already. And that's something that really to the extent that there's a final AV piece actually in the final space that is to do with what happened, because contemporaneity means that we never look forward in the narrative, but we wanted to have one piece that then says, articulates the fragments of information that relating to every single individual in terms of what happened afterwards. And some, for various practical reasons, some people that we had anticipated using, then we had to remove quite late on, but we left them in the final piece because we said I can't take them out of that now. That you know what I mean? That would just feel like there's no that's fine. They can just sort of stay like that. So it was that really. It was what was available, what we were trying to articulate, where we were getting it from. But it's really tough. Funny enough, one of the things which, like I said when I was talking through the images, one of the things which is always on my mind is that if you talk about individuals too much, I worry that you lose a sense of the vastness of the scale. But if you only talk about the scale, you lose the individuals, and both of those things are so critically important. It was just a question of trying to find different ways of dealing with that as well. So yeah, I mean, but for me, I was also felt very strongly that just because, like, and this actually goes for perpetrators too, just because there's no image of somebody, that shouldn't be a reason for not talking about them, because then their inclusion in the narrative is determined by what happens to have survived or not. And in respect of obviously Jewish individuals within the narrative, that was obviously the reason that the photos didn't exist, because their property was destroyed, and so that wouldn't be a good criteria alone for not doing it. So that's something we were quite mindful of as well.
Thank you. We'll go to a question from the chat now in the last few minutes. If you have more questions, please do send them in. And this one comes from Caroline Sifkin, who says she's yet to visit the museum, but wonders if you're able to speak a bit about the use of sounds within the exhibition.
Yeah, definitely. So sound was funny enough, I was talking to some people doing a research project about this yesterday. Sound was always, so as you mentioned at the start, my background was in theatre, so what I always had sound as a really important dimension of this approach within my head. But I was also felt that a lot of the use of sound, not just in Holocaust museums, but in museums generally traditionally, has been quite unimaginative. Let's say there's this sort of Foley approach to sound, so that you kind of do these sort of soundscapes of like literal environmental sounds that somehow speaks to authentic historical experience. Now I'm not convinced by that. Then funnily enough, we went to Poland in Warsaw, which I'm sure somebody would have been to, and they do some really interesting things with sound that speaks to sort of tone and atmosphere and context and concept, rather than speaks to sort of literal diegetic sound, you know, for the you know, emanate from the environment. So all of our sounds are uncoupled, with one exception, from the AVs. So the sound doesn't explicitly support the AVs, and it doesn't explicitly support any specific area of the narrative. But the idea is it's affective, and it affectively refers to conceptual ideas within the spaces. So that manifests in various different ways. One of them, which I have to give to the sound designers, you know, who were brilliant. It was a group in Switzerland called Idiom Klang. In the space on deportations, they recorded. We have a typewriter that belonged to Arthur Seyss-Inquart in the collections. So we recorded the keys of the typewriter being struck and the barrel on the typewriter being pulled. And then the sound company took that and used those sounds and sort of manipulated them. So they sound a bit like a train going over tracks, but it also sounds like the sort of the persistent thud of the typewriter key being pressed. And it really speaks in the way that you know, you have to hear in order to have any sense of the relationship between sort of bureaucratic process and the implementation of bureaucracy, but it's entirely experiential and entirely affective. And elsewhere we do things like in the section on evolution of or, you know, increasing isolation of Jewish people within the Reich as it expands. We use this sort of brown noise. It's called that. So it's this sort of weird noise that with it's sort of a tonal brown noise, but it speaks to the idea of, or somehow speaks to the position of Jewish people within the narrative, rather than it just being sort of insistent, you know, Nazi banging or you know, tub thumping and that sort of stuff. It tries to completely invert the subject position of the sound. So we use it in various different ways throughout. And then one thing which I'm sort of really pleased with sound wise, which just came really late in the day, is in the final sections, two final sections, the one on liberation and then into the legacy space, as we call it. We were looking at various different contemporaneous sources, and we found a piece of music called Dort in dem Lager, which you may well know, which was written in the DP camp in 1946. It's just one contemporaneous recording of it, but no known composer or vocalist. It's just the recording. So we took Dort in dem Lager, but the recording's really kind of crackly and it wouldn't have worked in the context. So we wanted to take the melody of it, but put it onto a different instrument. So we got in touch with Simon Wildfish, who's Anita Lasker-Wildfish's grandson. So Anita, cellist in the Auschwitz Orchestra. We have her red jumper on display in the galleries. Her grandson is now a cellist who lives in Berlin. So we got in touch with him and he recorded it in a studio in Berlin on the cello for us, and then we use that as the basis for the soundscape in the two sort of final spaces. So in the liberation space, it's really broken and fragmented, and he did stuff with kind of playing below the bridge or putting kind of enharmonics in it and stuff, so it has a slightly kind of fractured, broken sound. And then coming into the final space, it's more fully realized as a melody, but we don't say in the galleries, we've got this conversation going on at the moment because we don't say anywhere that it's Simon playing it. The reason we got Simon to play it is because we wanted to ensure, to its sort of minutest detail, that the person expressing the thing had a relationship to this that would make it somehow more meaningful in the ways that, you know, music can be. So but yeah, but that essentially, that's the whole conceptual approach to the sound is conceptual rather than kind of literal.
I was going to say, like, I didn't know that about the cellist. It's interesting, actually. I think we've got a final question, which is probably a good one to end on, actually. From Ivan, who says he'd be interested in things that aren't in the previous exhibition. For example, the shoes, the Zyklon B canister, and the large model of Auschwitz, which is what most people would probably remember from the previous exhibition. And he asks, is there a reasoning here? It seems to want to defocus from Auschwitz. I'm asking just because I know your answer, but I think that would be an interesting one to end on, about the changes and from the previous one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we were really keen to sort of really meaningfully contextualize Auschwitz within the galleries. I think certainly this research that emerged in the last week or two sort of speaks to this too, that Auschwitz is so centered in the memory of the kind of understanding that a lot of our visitors have coming into these galleries. And you know, I wouldn't want to diminish obviously the significance of Auschwitz, but we really did want to contextualize it alongside other sites of atrocity, and particularly in terms of, you know, historically its centrality, particularly with the relationship to Hungarian Jewish experience. So that's kind of appears there. There's a few different answers. The Zyklon B canister actually is on display, but if you've been to the galleries and you missed it, it's possible that we've got a slight issue at the moment with people missing the whole space on death camps, which is just one of those kind of real life things that the lighting means that people just, I think, just assuming that space is like an exit or something, or you know, so we're doing some work on that at the moment, because within the first couple of days I was walking around going, oh God, people are just missing that room. So we're addressing that. It's in there, so it's possible that you didn't sit in there. The piles of shoes are a slightly more complicated question. There's two reasons for that. One of them is entirely practical. They're a loan object from Majdanek, and it's the complicated thing to administer, and they'd come to the end of their kind of loan agreement, so they were going back. I sort of struggle with the shoes a bit personally, and I was reading quite a lot of stuff about this as well, which sort of informs my thinking a bit, and it really comes back to this question of the micro versus the macro. I worry with the shoes as they are, as we had them previously, that they speak somehow to a faceless mass, but they lose the sense of individual identity, and also because of the way that they were preserved historically, and they've degraded over the years, they've become very, very unlike shoes in a really practical way. They've all assumed this kind of brownish color, which they didn't have originally, which from what I understand, because I've answered this question to a number of different people over the years, from what I understand, is the preservation techniques that we used historically that have kind of, you know, done something to the, you know, to the leather, etc. So we didn't really have a place for them, and we thought, rather than doing a pile of shoes, let's do individual shoes. So there's a large picture, there's a large historic graphic of the shoes as they were, as you know, from the time, and then individual shoes at various points. The mounting of one of those objects is supposed to speak to its potential position on a larger pile, but to say within the pile are individuals, and this shoe looks very much like a shoe, not just a kind of a piece of leather bound in a certain way. And then the Auschwitz model, it's a complicated question. The really practical question is that we didn't have the space for it. It's 9 meters long and 3 meters wide, and you'd have, you know, there was no room for us in which to put it, particularly given the way that we were reconceiving the narrative. Also because of contemporaneity, it is an artistic work. It was done by Jerry Judah, who's obviously a sculptor. It was an artistic response to something, so it wasn't within our contemporaneity. It wasn't there, and also I think that you know, I mean, I need to be careful with this, but I sometimes worry a bit with some of those kind of approaches that they suggest they overplay certain dimensions of the narrative. And I think everything that I've read about Auschwitz, everything I can understand to the extent that one can about it, is that the whole function of that process was about visceral, brutal, violent movement. And that's what, you know, that's one of the ways in which it unfolded as it did, and I worry about that a bit. But the central answer is that it's huge, and it didn't fit. That said, you know, we're not, as an organization, we're looking at what should be done with it. It will, you know, that's something which is very active at the moment, and there are teams of people dealing with that. So I think one of the things I'm always really keen to emphasize is I think the previous exhibition was a product of the moment in time in which it occurred, and you know, the team worked incredibly hard on it, and it did a great job for 20 years. It happens that things have moved on a long way since then, and thinking's moved on a long way, and all sorts of things have changed. So that model was responding to the way that the things that, you know, the exhibition was put together at that stage, and obviously it's a completely different approach here, so obviously it wouldn't fit what we're doing.
Well, thank you very much, James. That brings us to the end of this evening's talk. Thank you so much for giving us that virtual tour of the museum, and for answering both Charlie and my questions, and everyone else's here. It's been fascinating to really talk these things through with you. And I know there's a lot of very grateful people in the chat saying thank you right now. Just to say to everyone, we will be having another British Association of Holocaust Studies postgraduate event in December, details of which we'll be announcing very soon, but that will be roughly sort of early to mid-December, and we'll be focusing on Holocaust consciousness in the UK in light of the recent reports from the Claims Conference and UCL. So please do look out both in emails and on Twitter for things about that. So once again, thank you, James, for speaking, and thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you have a good night.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.